social media.
Hi, social media. Love you. Hello and welcome to our Veterans Breakfast Club Monday night conversation. My name is Todd DiPastino. I'm the executive director of the Veterans Breakfast Club. We're a nonprofit that has been around since 2008. So this is year 17, based in Pittsburgh, but we do these programs every Monday night, every Thursday night, and we reach people around the country and around the world. And tonight we're doing a special conversation with Vietnam War veteran, Marc Leepson, who has joined us before. He is what you would call a prolific author. He has just released book number 11, and man, is it wildly successful. And I think one of the reasons it's so successful, apart from it being well researched and well written, is that it touches a nerve. The story of Doug Hegdahl is something of a legend in the history of the Vietnam War. It's been much discussed. His story has been even written about, but there has never been a full-length history of the unlikely and improbable story of Doug Hegdahl. If you don't know the outlines of the story, Doug Hegdahl is a young sailor on the USS Canberra in the Gulf of Tonkin. He falls overboard in April of 1967. He gets picked up by North Vietnamese fishermen. They hand him over to authorities. He gets transported to Hoa Lo Prison, the Hanoi Hilton, where he becomes the lowest ranking and the youngest POW among the hundreds who are there. Doug Hegdahl feigns a pretty severe mental disability so that he gets this nickname, the incredibly stupid one, by the North Vietnamese guards. And therefore, he's given some leeway that other prisoners don't have because he's not seen as a threat. He uses that freedom to memorize everything about most of the POWs being held at the Hanoi Hilton, brings it home on early release, and supplies kind of the U.S. government and the U.S. public with information about POWs they had never had before. So Marc Leepson is going to kind of unravel this whole story for us. He's going to sort fact from fiction for us, because there is, legendary stories like this get a lot of misinformation gets built up around it. So we're going to turn to that and have Marc share his story. But before we do, I do want to acknowledge one person in the room here, Ed Cottrell, who is turning 103 on Friday. Here is a picture of Ed. He is oh, I picked the right one. Is that Ed?
I see Ed.
Okay, good. Ed is a P-47 pilot, flew 65 missions in World War II. He's turning 103 on Friday, January 17th. And my favorite thing that I've received recently, it turns out, Ed, first of all, Ed, happy birthday.
Thank you. Thank you, Todd.
It is not easy to buy a birthday card for somebody who's turning 103. There aren't that many birthday cards that say happy 103rd birthday. But our enterprising friend here, Barb Smith from Ohio.
Hi, Barb.
She texted me this picture. She bought two cards for you, Ed. One says happy 100th birthday. One says happy third birthday. And together they equal 103. I love that. That's so much. So what are you going to do for your birthday, Ed?
I have no idea. My kids won't tell me anything. They just said get up in the morning and be ready to move because you're going to be busy all day.
Oh,
That's
boy.
all I know.
That is so great. Well, we'll be interested to hear the story of what I'm sure you're going to be doing some interesting things and talking to people. Ed, as you know, is extremely active at age 103 to be. So we'll be interested to hear what that day is like for you. Thank you, Ed.
Okay, Todd, thank you. Hi, everybody. Let's listen to the story now. I'm really interested in this program tonight.
Yeah, I am too. And I'm also interested in the program that we have coming up on Thursday, which is another little known story of World War II in the Caribbean. Glenn Flickinger, who is on tonight, will be hosting this program. And we have two experts, Nick DeVoe, one of our wonderful longtime Veterans Breakfast Club members. He lives in St. Lucia. He's the creator of the Great World War II Logbook Project. Nick, I know, is working on a book about World War II in the Caribbean. He'll be joining us on Thursday night to talk about this theater of war that doesn't get much attention. Glenn, you'll be hosting this program. Glenn will be hosting this program. And so that'll be Thursday, January
Yeah,
6th.
I found him. Glenn, I asked you to unmute.
Up. Sorry, I didn't realize I was not unmuted. You got me now?
How much do you
Gotcha.
know about World War II in the Caribbean, Glenn?
A thimbleful before this. A thimbleful. I mean,
Good.
everybody kind of understands the Panama Canal was important, right? But
Yeah.
there's a lot more to it than that. Nick and his good friend and colleague Lars McKee have done a lot of work in putting this together, and they've discovered themselves a lot of information, some really fascinating material, and how important it was in 1942 and 43. So it'll be interesting and revealing.
Yes. Yeah. There has not been much written about full length, certainly about World War II in the Caribbean. And I might be, I don't know if this is for public consumption, but I do know that Nick is working on a book that would be something of a guidebook for Americans and others who go on vacation in the Caribbean and they get sick of the beach and they want to see some historic sites that have to do with World War II because the Caribbean is just filled with World War II sites that very few people know about. So I think that's the coolest thing. So I look forward to this conversation. That's on Thursday, January 16th, 7 p.m. And then next week, a week from tonight, Monday, January 20th, we'll be back with open conversation. Our open conversations are always so robust. And we had an open conversation that was uh, I don't want to use the term hijacked by donut dollies, but was dominated by donut dollies, which was totally fantastic. It was totally great. But I think there are other subjects I wanted to get to. So we're gonna reserve next Monday for our open conversation, Veterans Open Conversation. All right, let's get to Doug. Doug, your book is The Unlikely Hero. Oh, I want to share my screen so I can show people the cover of your book. Um, Here is the book, The Unlikely War Hero, with a wonderful endorsement here by the great Tim O'Brien, one of the finest nonfiction narratives to emerge from the Vietnam War. I think the sales of this book have proven Tim O'Brien correct, that it's well written, it's well researched, it's a story extremely well told. Um, uh, Mark, how did you get on this story and how did you decide to devote a book to it?
Oh, yeah, good question, Todd. Thank you for having me on, by the way, and thanks for everybody for joining us. Just really quickly, you're right. The book came out December 17th, and we sold out the first printing actually a couple of days before the pub date because you could pre-order. So we are between printings right now, but the next printing should be out by the end of the week. In other words, if you go to your bookstore or go online, it's going to say either back ordered or out of stock, but copies are coming soon. So anyway, how did I come to it? Well, like you said, this story's been out there for a while, and I've known about it for a while. And about 25 years ago, after I finished a book, I was looking around for another one, and I thought I'd write the story of Doug Hegdahl. And I managed to track him down, and I called him, and we talked for a little bit. This was in '01, and
Oh, wow.
yeah, '01. And then I have a friend who is a screenwriter and director. He's also a Vietnam War vet, Patrick Shane Duncan. And Pat loved the idea and thought it should be a movie, but he said, you got to write the book first. So we decided that he would go down there. Doug lives in San Diego. He did then, he still does. And Pat talked to him about the book and about me doing it because I'm a Vietnam War vet and he's a Vietnam War vet if there would be a movie and da 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 da. Doug talked to him and then I called Doug back, I don't know, a week later, and he said, you know what, I'm not going to cooperate. I'm a private person. I don't want to do this. So that was the end of that in '01. And I've been thinking about it ever since. And when I finished my last book, in 2017, the Barry Sadler book, I wrote a biography of Barry Sadler, the Ballad of the Green Berets guy. I was looking around for another. I thought, you know what, I'm going to give it one more try. Doug was in hibernation. It was impossible to get a hold of him. And in fact, he hasn't spoken in public but a handful of times since then. He retired. He was working at the Sears School down in San Diego as a civilian since 1970 when he got out of the Navy. And he had retired then, and true to his word, he's a private person. If you look, around the internet, you might see him pop up on some documentaries, but they're from the late 90s, a couple in the early 2000s. Anyway, so that's the origin story, and I decided I was going to do it even if I couldn't talk to him.
Yeah, and we would certainly have loved to, because Doug Hegdahl is still alive, as you say. We would have loved to have had him join us, as I'm sure you would have loved to have been able to talk with him in great detail for your book. But he has not talked publicly at all about this for at least 25 years, from what I have gathered.
Yeah, that's true. So I can tell you a little bit more about how I went about doing it without him. Because he did talk a fair amount after he came back. Well, after the POW, he got out in August of '69 on an early release. And then that the prisoners were like 471 or whatever were released in January, February, March of '73 after the signing of the Paris Peace Accords. And after that, there was a book written about Dick Stratton, who was one of his roommates, and Doug and he were very close. And the writer interviewed Doug extensively. I mean, there's scores of quotes from Doug in that book, which came out in '74. So I got to use Doug's words, even though I didn't get them.
Right.
And in fact, I got Dick Stratton's contact information through a fellow writer named Heath Lee, who wrote a book about the POW wives called League of Women and League of Wives. And Heath had talked to a whole bunch of wives. She talked to the wives because I helped her with the book. She's young. She's in her early 50s, young compared to us old people. She's in her early 50s and didn't really know a lot about the Vietnam War. And I helped her in our book, and she's helped me. We're good colleagues. And she talked to a bunch of wives. None of them, they love Doug, by the way. They love Doug because he came home with all those names, and 63 families learned that their husbands were not missing in action, but were alive as POWs through Doug's information. So the wives loved him, but none of them had talked to him in same, decades. So,
Right.
But Dick Stratton agreed to help me, and he knows more about Doug than anybody because they roomed together and they were friends after Dick came home in '73. And he called Doug on my behalf. Doug said no, but Doug did tell him that, go ahead, Dick, you tell him everything you want. It's okay with me. So
That's
and
great.
Stratton,
Yeah. So you have kind of his tacit, Doug Hegdahl's tacit approval or, blessing for the book. And you were able to interview many people who knew Doug growing up, many people from the Navy, fellow POWs. I was wondering, could you tell us a little bit about his background? Because I find his background fascinating. Like so many
Sure.
Navy personnel, he comes from thousands of miles from the ocean, South Dakota.
Right, the landlocked state. Yeah. So, by the way, so that's where he grew up in the town of Clark, South Dakota, which is small, like 1,400 people. It's in central eastern part of the state. It's like a 4 hour drive west of Minneapolis and about 3 hours south of Fargo. It's farming country. And the family moved there when he was 6 years old. He has two brothers. His mom and dad, Abe and Edith, um, decided to go into the hospitality business, and they bought the old Clark Hotel, which is right here, a picture from the 60s. It dates from the 1880s. And the family lived there and worked there. Isn't that a beautiful, beautiful building?
That's one. That is so great. And it was the Hegdahl Hotel.
Right. Well, the nickname was, it was the real name was the Clark Hotel. But the people nicknamed it the Hegdahl Hotel. I didn't talk to a lot of people he grew up with. I talked to three, but two of them were really good friends of his, and they told me a lot about this. And the kids used to, so the family lived there, and the kids used to like to hang out in the lobby. And like I said, it wasn't exactly the Ritz, okay? It was a falling down old late 19th century hotel. And you know what they also nicknamed it? Believe it or not, I almost fell off my chair when one of the guys told me. The Hegdahl Hilton. The Hegdahl Hilton, right? For the guy who winds up in the Hanoi Hilton. It was just, yeah. So he grew up there. He was a practical joker. He was a smart kid, but he didn't, I don't want to say lazy. He just didn't apply himself. And he repeated one grade in elementary school. He graduated from high school in 19 and a half. He was a big kid, like 6'2", 220, 230, wrestled heavyweight on the wrestling team. Grew up in a small town in the baby boom years, like a lot of us in this room. Was in the Boy Scouts, just a kind of normal existence. And then, yeah, there's his high school yearbook picture, class of 66. And you know what happened? He was 19 and a half when he graduated. And 1966, the first big Vietnam War draft. So he knew he didn't have a job. He wasn't going to go to college. He was going to get snapped up in the draft. So he did what a lot of people did. He joined the Navy. His mom and pop drove him up to a place called Watertown. He signed on the dotted line. That was in the summer. In October, he went in. He had boot camp at the Naval Training Center down in San Diego. That's the old postcard, probably a little earlier than when Doug was there, but you get the picture. And then, he finished training, and he was supposed to be a postal clerk. For some reason, that never happened. It was one of those needs of the Navy things.
Yeah.
And he wound up going home for Christmas, back to San Diego, and then he shipped out to Subic Bay, at where the USS Canberra was in for repairs. So the Canberra was a World War II vintage guided missile cruiser. Okay, how many guided missiles did the U.S. fire in the Vietnam War?
Good question. How many guided missiles did the U.S. Navy fire in the Vietnam War?
How about none? Yeah.
Zero.
But they that we know
Okay.
of. I mean, they test fired, but so I should say fired in anger. For some, I don't know, maybe it was Pentagon restrictions, but they had these 5-inch and 8-inch guns, and they pounded the shit out of North Vietnam and South Vietnam. They had intel. You can see the missiles there on the Canberra. But in fact, the Canberra was one of the first two ships that had missiles. It was refitted after World War II in the mid 50s. And they had these, what they called Terrier missiles. Flip to the next slide, and then you'll be able to see the big guns. Next one, a little better. See them?
Yeah.
And look how narrow the deck is up there.
Yeah.
So the captain of the ship named Ed Rosenberg I talked to 17 sailors who served on that ship during their 5 Vietnam War cruises, including 7 guys who were on the second cruise, which Doug was on. And they described to me what it was like with the guns firing, and Rosenberg, who was trigger happy. I mean, the reason that they were in for repairs at Subic Bay in February of 67 was they blew out the barrels of the 8-inch guns. They fired tens of thousands of shells into, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. So they were reboring or whatever the hell they do. By the way, I was in the Army, so if I make any Navy mistakes, please forgive me. I had a couple of Navy buddies, clue me in on Navy stuff. But anyway, so what was
Yeah,
the question? I forgot.
guaranteed you're going to make a Navy mistake,
Yeah.
Mark, because the Navy is impenetrable and not understandable. Um, and here's a question. Here's a Navy question. I hear people say, so you say the USS Canberra was on 5 Vietnam cruises. How long is a cruise?
It varied. I mean, I can't remember to tell you the truth, but I think that the Doug's cruise, for instance, it started in February after they reboard, and then of course he went over in April, and I think it was I'll just say just about a year,
Okay,
maybe 9 months to a year.
I see Chris Parolo, Navy veteran, smirking at me because of my comment about the Navy. Very sorry, Chris. I do not. The Navy can sometimes be hard for me to fully
Listen,
understand.
one of the people, Todd, one of the people I interviewed for Navy stuff was Ed Marolda. I don't know if people know about Navy history, but he's the top Vietnam War naval historian. And he filled me in on a lot of stuff. And we were talking one day, and I said, Ed, I've been reading the ship's logs, and it said they went to some status. I can't remember what it was, some term. They went into blank status. What is that? He goes, I don't know. I was in the Army in the Vietnam War. I'm like, thanks very much. I'll look it up, So
So this is the date in question. Doug Hegdahl, went overboard at 4:30 a.m. on April 6, 1967. How did that happen?
good question. Okay, this is not the actual picture, but it's what it would have looked like at the time. So he was on the ship. He was a member of the deck crew, which were guys that lived underneath the deck, right? And did the shitty jobs, swabbing the deck when they weren't underneath the deck, painting everything that didn't move. And in Doug's
Right.
case, he was an ammo humper. And 12 hours, 12 hours on, 12 hours off. A lot of watch, which we call in the Army guard duty,
Our duty, right?
day and night underneath. And that Canberra had about 1,100 on board, including a detachment of about 100 Marines. But the deck crew lived in those stinky, non-air conditioned below decks. Anyway, one night, 4 o'clock in the morning, he couldn't sleep. The guy said, if you haven't seen it, the night firing is really cool. So he got up, got out of his bunk, didn't even take his glasses, went up on the deck, see how narrow it is. And the next thing he knew, he says he was in the Gulf of Tonkin. Does not remember what happened.
He doesn't
No one
remember.
saw it. And, Doug testified before Congress that he didn't know what happened. I read 2 of his official debriefings, which have been declassified. He told the debriefer, the Marine Corps debriefer, that he did not remember what happened. He's told everybody who's ever asked he did not remember. So he either did or didn't, but it looks like he doesn't remember it. And that's how he wound up in the drink.
And
Well,
Mark,
we don't know how he ended up.
I mean,
Go ahead.
it's believable. If I'm looking at this picture and if it was night firing like this, you see how narrow the bow of the ship is. You can imagine if somebody comes aboard deck side to watch the firing, you could imagine not only the sound but the shaking. I mean, you could easily imagine somebody falling overboard and nobody noticing.
Yeah. Well, I talked to the sailor, every one of those sailors, I asked about it. Some of them said, no, no, I've been up there a million times. You can't. Others said, yeah, if it pitched in one direction and the guns were going in another, it's very possible. And of course, the word scuttlebutt.
Right.
Right. So there are about 12 different theories, but no one saw it. So, he was pushed, he got into a fight, he committed suicide, he was a spy. The CIA trained him to jump into the South China Sea at 4 o'clock in the morning and wait to be picked up by a fisher boat.
Wow. So this is the stuff of scuttlebutt,
Yeah, it really
rumors and
is.
gossip. Yeah.
Well, hey, would you go back to that slide
Yeah,
there?
I will.
Because so you all might not know this, but the deck logs back in the Vietnam War era are all declassified by the National Archives and online and searchable. So I downloaded the appropriate deck logs, and you can see that's my writing there. The reason I say that he went overboard about 4:30 is right there. It said, you see where it says 4:15 commenced firing,
Yes.
and then they ceased firing at 4:42. So that's how we know that if he did, that's when he went overboard. Yeah,
And Mark, my understanding is they didn't notice him go. Nobody saw him go overboard,
that's right.
and they didn't
And the
notice he
weird
was
thing
missing.
that's the other kind of strange thing. So at the first muster the next morning, and that's what I've written in red there, the 740 muster, all were present and accounted for. But they had a second muster that morning at 11:30, and that's when he was reported missing. So some people think he may have gone over between 7:40 and 11:30, which I strongly doubt. I think there was just some screw up there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and anyway, then when they did two searches of the ship and figured he went overboard. They did not do any official search and rescue that we know about. It didn't make the deck logs. I talked to three young officers who were on duty that day. They don't remember. They said the ship did not turn around. It did not. It went on about its business. It was refueling and this and that and this and that. They don't remember any aircraft search and rescue. And they think Ed Rosenberg just said, screw it, I got stuff to do. And that was that. And so
Eh,
the account that we have of what happened after he hit the water is all Doug talking to people later and in congressional testimony and in those books. And he says that he was screamed. Nobody could hear him. The ship pulled away. He tried to stay afloat. He almost gave up. When the dawn came, he was about to floating on his back, thinking that he had it, and he heard a fishing boat coming, and he whipped off his t-shirt, and the guys picked him up. And Doug says he was not captured. He was the only POW who was not captured. He was the only POW in the Hanoi Hilton was not captured. He was rescued. So he was rescued by these guys on a fishing boat. They actually treated him nicely. They gave him warm, dry clothes and gave him some food. But then they took him to shore and they turned him over to the authorities and they shipped him up to, yeah, it's Hoa Lo Prison, aka the Hanoi Hilton.
And here it is. Here's the infamous Hanoi Hilton Hoa Lo Prison. Remnants of it still exist. You could tour it. We've toured it with the Veterans Breakfast Club several times. Several people on this program, Zoom, came on our trip. It's a haunting place, I would say.
Yeah, and for our purposes, there were other camps in and around Hanoi, right? But
Right.
we use the general term Hanoi Hilton, but for most of the time, Doug was in the plantation and the zoo. I think I have a slide that shows where some of those yeah. So, but
And
the,
yeah,
the
the
wallow,
plantation, Dirty
right,
Bird,
right,
Alcatraz, the zoo
the zoo,
annex.
right. And they moved the guys around for no apparent reason. I mean, no one could quite figure it out. Although one of the ones, rock pile, I think, was where they tended to put the biggest resistors, the guys that just said spit in their faces and said fuck you to the interrogators,
Okay.
and then got
How many,
tortured. Yeah.
Mark, at this time, April 1967, how many American POWs were being held in the North? Do we have a good count?
We don't have a good count, but we look, the military did have intel. First of all, the North Vietnamese, they didn't let on, except when it suited their purposes. Like when John McCain got captured, remember, his
Yeah.
father was the naval chief of operations in the Pacific. They knew that. So they took pictures of him and sent it out.
So I'm
And
sorry, Mark, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but so you're saying if somebody was shot down or like Doug Hegdahl picked up and transported to prison, the family, no authorities were notified that he was now being held as a prisoner of war?
Only if they had evidence of it. They were listed as missing in action. You know, you were flying next to me. I saw you go down. I saw the parachute. I
So
flew back.
The North Vietnamese didn't report it to the Red Cross or to any
Oh
international
no,
nothing like
no,
that.
no,
So families back home, unless there was an eyewitness, had no idea.
no. Well, we did have intel. We did have intel. And the other thing is they didn't allow any American press there, but they allowed friendly press like East Germans and like communist leaning Japanese newspapers and stuff like that. And so they would let them, talk to POWs, in showrooms where they'd clean them up, give them good food, and they would report, and then, Captain Todd DiPastino came in. He was from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was flying an F-5. So we had that, and then through some letters that got out, some of the POWs in code told their family and loved ones. So we had intel on. I don't I never could find the exact number, but the best guess is around that time they probably had 250 to 300 in the Hanoi Hilton complex. And we had info on a fair number of them, probably 150. I don't know. It's never been totally accurate. But
So
we
what
do
would
know.
his,
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I was going to say, so Doug memorized 254 names, ranks, and services, and any other information he could pick up about them. Now, remember, the POWs at that point were not allowed to converse with each other, to talk to each other, except your roommate. But remember, they evolved the tap code, right?
Yeah.
Where they could tap on the wall of the adjoining cells. And the first thing they did was ask, "Who are you? Where are you?" And they
Right.
would spread the word around. They also passed notes. They were allowed to go to the shower and the toilet, and they would write on the back of, they got cigarettes every day, 3 cigarettes. They would take the wrapper off and find something to write with and pass
Wow.
notes. So, yeah. So,
So
Doug memorized.
what would his reception at the Hanoi Hilton have been like? I mean, was he
Yeah.
was interrogated?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I read memoirs of and oral histories of, dozens of POWs at the Hanoi Hilton. Almost all of them tell the same interrogation story. They were either shot down or they crashed. They managed to land safely, within minutes to an hour or two. They were surrounded by villagers and militiamen who turned them over to the army. They took them to the Hanoi Hilton and they went through the similar interrogation. There was a place called New Guy Village, one of the camps, and um, it could be brutal. They wanted to know everything, and so the pilots either told them lies or made up stuff that they couldn't verify, or they refused, and if they did, they got tortured. Doug was able to use his wits out to outfox them. But first of all, to convince them that well, he was what he really was, which was a seaman apprentice E2 who fell off a ship, who was an ammo humper, who didn't know shit about anything that they could use. So so he was never tortured. He was never tortured. He was made to, stand up or kneel with his knees on rice for an hour or two, wrapped up one time. He wasn't solitary for 9 months after he lost his temper one time, which was not good. But he was never, the ropes. You all know about the ropes thing, that torture thing they did, and beating him with rubber hoses, and guys died in there after
Yeah.
being tortured.
Yeah.
So Doug wasn't, because he convinced them that he had nothing to give them. And he didn't have free reign, but he had more time outside of his cell than any of the other prisoners because they thought he was a dunce, right? They would ask him to, where he was from, and he would tell them Clark, but I forgot how do you spell Clark? How do you spell Clark? They give him an
So,
ink pen and he put it in his mouth, and the ink would drip all over his chin. So they thought he was just a dumb hick from, yeah.
Okay, two questions. Number one, well, I guess more of a statement and asking you to confirm it. Did the North Vietnamese, they must have been befuddled by him. He's so much younger. He's not an officer, and they usually, I mean, most of the POWs were officers. They were members of air crews, correct? And here's a low-ranking seaman who seems young, says he went overboard. Were they suspicious of him?
Yeah, at first, but he convinced them that he was this young kid and that he was just a lowly sailor on this ship. And so, yeah, that happened. And
So he feigns extreme ignorance. And is there for what reason? Is there is there a goal? Is there
you know, no one told him to do it. There, there was no SEER school for him, survival and
yeah,
rescue school. He figured it out. He was a smart kid, and it just hit him from the very beginning to do this, and it worked. And the more it worked, the more he did it. And that was also the main reason why they wanted him out of there. They were always offering early releases, but it came with strings attached. You had to, sign a paper that said you were against the war and you were a war criminal and you were a Yankee air pirate.
right.
Yeah. There's Doug. So by the way, Doug, so he was let out of his cell, regularly, and he learned the sweep code, right? It was similar to the tap code, but you did it with the broom. So he knew guys were peering out of the slits over the
Wow.
top of their doors when he was out there. And if he had any information to give, he learned how to do it in this code, kind of like Morse code with the broom. It's crazy. That's
So
a
Mark,
colorized picture, but it's real.
and this
Yeah,
is an official North Vietnamese released photograph, correct?
correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And
Um,
somebody asked, did Doug's parents know about him? Yes, they did. When he was captured, they let out the fact that they had him and about three or four others. So his picture was in the not I can't remember with his picture, but I mean, there's newspaper articles from his hometown saying Doug Hegdahl being held. They didn't let it be known till May. He was captured on April 7th.
when did he lose his temper?
Yeah, that was I can't remember. I said sometime like in the summer of '68.
What
Um,
happened?
I can't remember. It's in the book, but I think he passed a note, and the other guy got caught, and they tortured the hell out of this other guy. And Doug said, "You can't do that. He didn't do anything. Blah blah blah. Okay, come with us." And it was cold in Hanoi in the winter, and it was hot in the summer. And those cells were the worst ones were very small. And Doug went on a hunger strike, by the way, to protest his treatment. I don't know that any other POWs went on a hunger strike. And there's picture. I think you can see pictures of him
Yeah.
afterward. He weighed, about 220 when he went overboard, and he probably weighed about 150 or 160 after 9 months on meaning. And plus, look, the food they gave him was slop, right? They were fed twice a day, watery soup, bread. The Vietnamese, the only good thing the French did in their colonizing years was bread. So they had good bread over there, but not the bread that they gave the POWs. It was all mealy and old and stale and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, there's Doug after. So early, would I say 5 months, 9 months? Yeah, it was, yeah. So it was like the early fall of '68 into early of '69. And then he asked for glasses. He didn't have these glasses, and so they didn't want him to die of starvation. So they gave him the glasses and let him out and started feeding him bananas and stuff. So he weighed more. He was very skinny. There's pictures later of when he got out in August, but he wasn't emaciated. Let's put it that way.
What made him start the project of memorizing names and information about fellow POWs?
That's a good question. And the answer is that, one of the things that the POWs all talk about was, besides the horror of being tortured and being treated inhumanely, the other biggest problem was boredom. They had nothing to do, nothing to read, hours, hours, hours at a time. So that, for that reason, and because of what the Koreans did during the Korean War, which was not tell us anything about anybody, and because they knew the North Vietnamese were following basically in that everybody, not everybody, but guys who could started memorizing names.
Okay.
So it was a thing. John
Okay.
McCain had 350. He
Oh,
never got home early, but but they figured even if they came home late, they would keep track of people. So others had lots of names. When Doug was thrown in with Dick Stratton, now I told you that they moved guys around for no apparent reason. You just one day the guards came in and said, "Pack your stuff up. You're going over here." So I think his second roommate was Dick Stratton. It couldn't have been more different. Dick was 15 years older. He was a high flyer. Uh, got shot down and it was with F5, I think. Stanford graduate at Georgetown, later went to Stanford, da 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 da. And he described to me the day Doug walked into his cell, this 19-year-old, well, he was 20 by then, 20-year-old kid. And he looked at him and thought, "What the hell are you doing here?" And anyway, and he was suspicious a little bit. And then he got to know Doug within a day or so. They bonded and they're friends to this day. And so Stratton and Doug loved to talk and Stratton would listen to him while away the hours and joke around and so on. And one day, Doug said to Dick, "Can you recite the Gettysburg Address?" And Dick said, "Sure, you know, 7 years ago. Can you recite it backwards?" He says, "What are you, crazy?" Doug says, "I can." Dick, go, go ahead and write the words down on the floor here. They had the dirt floor and he had a rock or something. So he wrote the words down. While he was doing it, or after he finished, Doug recites it backwards. And Stratton goes, "Holy shit, you were a..." So I'm talking to a bunch of veterans here, right? I can use a little bit of salty language, right? Is that okay?
a little bit.
Okay. Sorry. He said, "Oh, shucks. Gosh darn it. This guy got a memory on him." So he said, "Look, we're memorizing names. I want you to start memorizing." And Doug said, "Okay, I always I can name all the presidents and stuff." And so that's how it got started. And by the way, Dick told me that years later, they were like probably in the late 70s or early 80s. He and his wife and Doug were going somewhere to some event in a car, and Alice Stratton started telling that story about the Gettysburg Address, and Doug started cracking up. And Dick said, "What, Doug, what are you laughing about?" He goes, "You know what, Dick? You think I could say that backwards? I was reading it. I was reading the words off the floor as when you wrote them all down." So,
So
but
that's another
if
one
you
of
read,
those legends. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and the legend continues. So, but the truth is, he did have a good memory. So, yeah, this was them. That's a posed picture from a German propaganda film. And actually, that was before they roomed together, and they exchanged a few words in the shower there. Um,
Huh.
and so he was in with Dick, and then one day took him out. He had memorized maybe 100 names, maybe more, and he got put in with a guy named Joe Krecka. I have a picture of Joe, and I got to talk to Joe extensively. Um, and he picked up where Dick Stratton left off, and he drilled Doug, and they got the names through the tap code, right? They either tapped with somebody who they knew, they got it directly from him, or that they got some name from that guy who got tapped from somebody else. So by the time he was done with Krecka, he had 254 names, ranks, service numbers, and other info. Uh, and then, Stratton had ordered him to go home, right? Because the Vietnamese didn't want him there. He knew they'd let him go. But Doug refused the order. So, they had this unofficial chain of command behind the bars in the prison. And Stratton was the ranking officer in the plantation. So he got an order from he explained what he wanted from the ranking officer in the whole Hanoi Hilton, and he said, "Yeah, tell him to go home." So Dick ordered him to, and Doug refused because the other prisoners did not exactly think highly of the POWs who took early release. Little known story. Do you know that there were 12 early releases out of all of those prisoners? Just 12.
Just
And when
12.
that's right. And when you ask the POWs about them, and people do, they don't have very good things to say about him. But then they'll always say, oh, those, traitors. Oh, wait, no, except one, Doug Hegdahl, the only one who was ordered to go home, the only one who came home under good circumstances. So Doug wouldn't go the first time. Stratton honored that request. And then, 9 months later, after he got out of solitary, it was time. And Dick ordered him again, and he accepted, and he went home in August. What was it, 7th, 1969.
So he comes home in August 1969, and was he one of the first to come home with information on fellow POWs?
Yeah, yes, exactly. He was in the second group of three. That's a picture that the North Vietnamese, yeah,
Okay.
both of those, when he was, before the hunger strike, when he was newly captured,
Okay.
after the hunger strike. Yeah. Same. Yeah. So he came home with these two pilots, Wes Rumble and Bob Frischman, both of whom were had only been there less than a year. Both of whom were not in good shape. Frischman almost died. He broke his elbow so badly it had to be replaced. And he was basically in solitary the whole time. Rumble had a real bad back issue. He was in solitary. Anyway, they were released. And when they got home, Doug spilled the 254 names, and he had been there, 2.5 years. He, for the first time, and Frischman, who had heard about it, gave information about details about the inhumane treatment, including torture. So this was the first time, and it happened in, uh, uh, a month after they got home, on September 2nd, 1969, when they had that press conference. This was one of the guys, so they sent a group over to, release them in a big propaganda thing, anti-war guys. That guy on the right is Rennie Davis, who was
Yeah.
one of the leaders of the anti-war movement,
Right.
and he was two other people.
Abby Hoffman, maybe?
That's Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, but they didn't
Jerry
have anything to
Rubin.
do. That's the only picture I could find of
Okay.
Rennie Davis.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it.
So there were no strings attached. We did not release any POWs in exchange for our POWs. Somebody asked that question.
Okay.
Yeah.
So here he is when he gets released. This is, or after.
Right. They flew in a commercial plane to Vientiane, Laos, where they had a little tiny press conference after they got off the plane. You can see how skinny they all are.
Yeah.
They went to the ambassador's house, and then they flew to Bangkok. I got a picture of that, I think. Yeah, that's them getting off the Thai Airlines plane in Bangkok. Went to the ambassador's house again, and then they got on a plane that flew them home. They got unis at the stopover at Frankfurt Airport, and they all included their ranks that they got promoted to.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this is the press conference when they got off the plane at was it LaGuardia or Kennedy? One of the two airports in New York City. That's Abe and Edith, his parents, behind him.
Oh, how
And
great.
that's Frischman's wife. Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
That was on the tarmac. So, should we talk about the Go Public campaign, or?
Yeah, could you tell us briefly what the Go Public campaign was?
Yeah.
Because I think it's
So
really
you know that the
it's really
Johnson.
interesting and important. Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is a bigger issue than Doug, but it ties right into what happened with Doug after he came back. But the Johnson administration didn't want to have anything to do with the POW issue. They turned their backs on the wives who came to them and said, please, can you do something to get us information about our husbands being held up there besides the propaganda? They wouldn't allow the Red Cross. They wouldn't, da, da, da. Johnson said, no, it's best to keep it quiet. We're trying to negotiate with these people. Well, when Nixon came in January 69, he turned that policy around. And they started, by the spring of 69, the POW issue was the biggest issue in the Vietnam War. What are they doing to our men? Well, they're being tortured, they're inhumane, Geneva Accords, et cetera, et cetera. So they announced what they called the Go Public versus the Go Private campaign that the Johnson administration had. And that's Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird. And they had press conferences and they started talking about all this stuff. So I talked to the deputy director and then the later director of POW/MIA affairs under Nixon, who told me, yes, indeed, it was the #1 issue of the war when Doug came home in August of 69. And then came the press conference on September 2nd, 1969 at Bethesda Naval. And, there are tons of reporters there. And there's Doug and Frischman. Frischman did a lot of talking. Doug didn't say too much. Most of the reporters asked questions about Frischman. But this was the first time that the American public got firsthand information about the torture and other inhumane treatment that the POWs. This was big, and it was part of the Go Public campaign. So the other thing that happened on September 2nd, 1969 is, next slide, please.
Oh,
Ho Chi Minh died, okay? I mean, because of the 12-hour difference, it didn't come out till the next day. But what happened was, in conjunction with the three things, the Nixon administration getting tough, going public, Ho Chi Minh's death, which created there was a change brewing in the Politburo of North Vietnam. And because Ho Chi Minh was getting old anyway, but when he was gone, there was a change in the leadership. And they decided that because of the Nixon administration pressure and the information given by Doug and Frischman about what was happening, that they were going to make things a little bit easier for the POWs. So there is a Politburo, well, let's go back to that. There was a Politburo.
I do. Yeah.
We're
Politburo.
running out of time. Yeah,
No,
let me just
go
say
ahead.
this. There was a Politburo resolution that came out to that effect, which has been declassified, and you can read it on the internet. It says, communist propaganda, well, we've always treated these men humanely. Bull crap. But we are going to even make it easy. And you know what? If you read, the torture did not stop. But if you read what the POWs who were there, including Jim Stockdale, including Denton, all of them say that torture went, extremely rare after that. They gave him 3 meals a day instead of 2. They gave him 5 cigarettes instead of 2. They let him talk to each other for the first time. So there is a macro aspect to what, it wasn't because of what Doug did, giving him the 250, but that was a part of it. And by the way, like I said, once they cross-checked all the names and the information we had, 63 families knew that their father's, sons, brother's, loved one was not missing, but was alive.
I want to highlight that again, Mark. Could you say that again?
Yeah. The information that Doug gave of those 254 names, they must have had intel on all but 63. But 63 families learned that their loved ones were not missing. They changed their status from missing in action to prisoner of war, which meant that they were alive.
That's huge.
So it's huge. Yeah. And nothing like that ever happened in the Vietnam War.
That's amazing. Doug Hegdahl did get a parade, correct?
He did get a parade in Clark, in his hometown. This is a great picture that's Abe and Edith in the back of the convertible. I was down the little main street. I love that tractor in the background. It's just
Yeah,
perfect.
I love it.
And they went to the high school. Everybody showed up, and they had a big party. And Doug had a big grin on his face. But I talked to two of his friends who hung out with him that week he was home. He was not a happy camper. He did not like the limelight. He had an escort. He had an official escort following him around. Well, he wanted to go. He snuck out one day and had beer with the guys and didn't even talk about the names. He didn't even talk about what he did. He just wanted to, talk about when they, blew up somebody's mailbox with cherry bombs when they were high school kids,
Yeah, yeah. He wanted to be a normal citizen again, a normal,
Right. And he never could be.
and he
And,
never could.
after that, when he was back in the Navy sent him around the country to meet with families. I think they made 11 trips. Frischman did too. Rumble was sick, and he went to the Air Force Hospital and just dropped out. But Doug and Frischman went and visited families, and he was able to walk up to people and said, "Oh yeah, I saw your father, 6 weeks ago. He was alive. He's doing
Boy,
okay." Yeah.
that's another great service. And
Yep.
and so he ended up teaching at the Sears School.
All right. He got out of the Navy in around I think September something of 70, a few weeks early. I don't know. He got an early out for some reason. And he went to San Diego and he showed up at Sybil Stockdale's house. Jim Stockdale everybody knows Jim Stockdale, right? I mean, he was the ranking POW in Hanoi Hilton, tortured beyond belief for 8 years, and Medal of Honor recipient, scholar. Anyway, Sybil Stockdale, and she was a leader in the POW wives movement. She co-founded the National League of Families. And she took him in. He lived in her basement. I talked to two of his sons, Stockdale. He's gone, she's gone. But they have 3 or 4 sons. And I talked to 2 of his sons. One of them was a little boy at the time. He remembers Doug. And Doug, was like the good, the fun uncle to have around. He took him to Little League practice and cheered for him and that kind of stuff. And then we don't know for sure, but we think that Sybil Stockdale got him that job in the Sears School at San Diego, which has since been renamed for Jim Stockdale. And he went to work as a civilian instructor starting in 71 and retired in 01. And he became more and more private as the years went by.
And Sears stands for survival, evasion, or escape.
Don't ask me. I was in the Army, man. Come on. I don't know.
Survival, escape, evasion, resistance. Come on, Navy guys.
Yeah.
Right? Or Air Force. Ben Wright knows. He took it. Larry Googans is shaking his head like, how dumb could these people be? What does it stand for? I'm sorry, pardon my ignorance. Ben?
I think it's survival, evasion, resistance, and escape.
Got it.
SERE.
SERE.
They weren't
Yeah.
using an acronym when I went through survival school and POW training, but that's what they call it now.
Okay. Okay. And I think resistance was something that was added later. I think there had been a survival, escape, evasion.
Well, we had
Training.
resistance training when I had POW training, but they didn't use the acronym.
Okay. Well, let's take a station break, a very brief station break, and then return with questions and further conversation with Marc about Doug Hegdahl. I do want to let people know that we have a trip coming up to the World War II Museum, the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. This will be our 3rd trip there that we've done. Right now, I think we have 25 people on the trip. We have 5 more seats, and that means we have 5 more seats on our group air from Pittsburgh direct nonstop to New Orleans and back. So if anybody is interested in joining our trip, please do let us know. You don't have to take the group air from Pittsburgh if you're traveling from elsewhere, but this will be April 7th through 11th. You could find out all the information, the itinerary about the trip at veteransbreakfastclub.org/travel. What will be different about this trip is it's going to be 2 days at the museum, and Glenn and I worked on with the museum staff to get a custom behind the scenes tour that'll take us into the vault and the archive and see artifacts that aren't on display and cool stuff like that. So if you'd like to join us, and of course there's New Orleans to enjoy, if you'd like to join us, just let me know. You can send me a message and let me know. We also have finally released our final itinerary for our World War II Battlefields Tour of Europe. This will be a 2-week tour that'll take us from London to Portsmouth to Cherbourg to Normandy, Eindhoven, Bastogne, Luxembourg, Heidelberg, Munich, Eagle's Nest, kind of following the track of the 101st Airborne Division. We'll see all those World War II sites. You could find out more information about that trip and the itinerary and the price and all that stuff at veteransbreakfastclub.org/WW2Europe. And then finally, we have our magazine. It is at the printer right now. It will be printed and shipped to over 10,000 households and mailed to 10,000 households. And then we'll have another 7,500 boxed up in boxes of 100 that we will begin to send out for bulk mailing. Jim Jameson is the guru, the tireless volunteer who keeps track of our mailing list, which is enormous, and makes all the corrections. He prints the mailing labels. I pretend like I'm the one who does all this work because Jim never asks for any kind of acknowledgement or thank you or anything like that. Finally, after so many years, I'm finally shamed. I shamed myself into admitting that Jim actually does all this work. So he's the one who sends all this out. I'm so grateful to him. We work hard to keep this list up to date. If you don't receive the magazine in the mails because we don't have your address, let us know. We'd be happy to send you a copy every quarter. You can see that the cover story is on the oath that you take, which has an interesting history and meaning. And Daria Summers is on the program tonight. She is our expert managing editor who, and I can tell you right now, if there are any mistakes in the magazine, they are mine and mine alone. They are not Daria's, because she has caught every single possible mistake I think that I made in putting this magazine together. But anyhow, if you want to receive the magazine, let us know. We'd be happy to send you 1 or 25 or 50 or 100 if you want to distribute them. All right, let's get back to the conversation here. Let's open it up, Mark, if you don't mind. Let's open it up to discussion. I know that Rich Kensinger is going to have comments here. We'll get to you, Rich, certainly about the trauma that Doug Hegdahl experienced. I have no doubt that he must have post-traumatic stress. But instead, we have Ben. Hello, Ben.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
I have to admit, this is the first time I've really spoken on here, and I'm glad to be a member and enjoyed the podcast and the Zoom meetings. I had the few years ago, Charlie Plum, who was a POW during that time, was a guest speaker at the Veterans Day at our National Veterans Memorial in Columbus, Ohio. And he spoke about Doug in his thing. He has a great book out called I'm No Hero. And he's a great motivational speaker too, Colonel Charlie Plum, if you look on YouTube. And so I learned about Doug during this time, and it was a great story. And when I give my docent tours, I mention him when I go through the tap codes and everything about what he did. And he's quite a guy.
It's striking to me. Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you for joining us and for being part of our community here. Mark, you said a couple times that prisoners weren't allowed to talk to each other. That is, that's torture right there. I mean, to my mind, for somebody who gabs as much as I do, if I wasn't permitted to talk to people, I think I would lose my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, even though Doug was in there with a couple hundred other guys, very few of them ever talked to him, right? I mean, I interviewed Everett Alvarez, who was there when Doug was there.
Yeah.
He said, I heard about him. His word got around through the grapevine, through the tap code. But, the only thing he couldn't tell me anything that he knew face to face from Doug. Yeah. So, like I said, boredom, they all talk about it. Porter Halliburton, you know that name? He's a great guy, Navy flyer. He was a POW for 6 or 7 years. He's written 2 books. His new book really, I think, is one of the better ones. Can't think of the name of it right now, but Porter Halliburton, his memoir, he talks about that. And I got to talk to Porter too, a real gentleman and a real good man. Yeah.
Yeah,
We have-
I also had spoken to at the museum there, Colonel Moe, who was a prisoner of war for quite a while at Hanoi Hilton too. That spoke about him. And yeah, that tap code, like Charlie mentioned, that when he was first put in isolation, he heard a rap on the wall, and a wire came through with a piece of toilet paper on it.
Yeah.
And said, memorize this and eat it. And it was the tap code.
I hope it wasn't used toilet paper.
I don't know about that. He didn't mention that.
Yeah, I've heard Charlie Plum speak. You know, I never got to talk to him, but he loves to talk about Doug.
He's a great guy.
prolific. He's given lots and lots of talks.
Here's a question that Bob Flage chatted to me privately here. Was there ill will by other prisoners towards those who were released early?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It ranged from, guys who would kill them if they could see them, to guys saying, I wished he hadn't done it. It wasn't a really good thing. But no, there was a lot of ill will. That's why Doug refused the order from Stratton not to go home, because at that point only 3 had gone home before Doug, and the prisoners had very little good to say about them.
Right. Rich, let's talk with Marc here about post-traumatic stress and the kind of PTSD that Doug, I'm guessing, did experience and the other POWs have.
Let me offer this observation, just to put it in context. I served as an ER medic at Andrews Air Force Base. The last month of my deployment, I was part of a team, just the medic part, because I was an ER medic. And we talked about what would happen to these people when they came back, because they're experiencing what I refer to is a biopsychosocial deconstruction of each person. And when we talked about that, we talked about the length of their reconstruction. We called it the biopsychosocial reconstruction. It could be more than 5 years before they could re-enter human experience. I mean, we're beyond PTSD. If that's part of it, it's complex because of these repeated exposures. So no wonder he comes back and he doesn't talk about it. If I don't talk about it, maybe I could forget about it. But it appears in his dreams. He has nightmares. But the more I talk about it, the more real it becomes. So it's kind of a form of protective denial. There's no way that could have happened to me and other people. That's my observation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rich. Marc, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I have no training in psychology, but of course, I've written about the Vietnam War for ages, and I know a fair amount of layman's knowledge about post-traumatic stress and about post-traumatic stress disorder. And, I can't diagnose Doug, but something's not right. Yeah. And to add to what you said, he was kind of forced to talk about it. He was forced to go out in public. He was forced to go around and meet people.
Exactly.
And that not everyone was. He was an early returnee, early releasee. The guys that came back in bulk, in March, and April, January, February, March of 73, didn't have to do that. They went home to their families after they got debriefed. Now, Doug was in Bethesda Naval for a month. And it
Hmm.
was partially debriefing, it was partially physical health, but I'm guessing there was some sort of mental health component to that.
There's also survival guilt.
Yeah.
I got early. I got out early. A lot of people did not.
Yeah.
I've survived it. That's it.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
done now. Survivor guilt is just incredible among military personnel, especially those who have been in combat.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rich.
You're
I'm-
welcome.
George Canalos, I'm fascinated by the comment you put here in the chat. I don't recall you meeting you at one of our Zoom programs before. Thank you for joining us. You served on the USS America in 1972, and you met Doug Hegdahl?
Well, thanks. Yeah, I'm new to Veterans Breakfast Club, and I really enjoy these sessions. I did. I was part of a Navy reconnaissance squadron. I flew about 70 plus missions over North Vietnam in the Vigilante. But on the 30-day transit from Virginia to the Gulf of Tonkin, Doug was aboard,
Oh.
and he briefed each of the squadrons in turn. And it was just spellbinding to hear his story. We were totally unfamiliar with it. And
What
how
year was
he-
that, George? When was that?
June of 72.
So he was a civilian at the Sears School.
Yes, he was.
Yeah. And he was on a flight from where to where?
No. This was the
Oh.
USS America aircraft carrier, and we were deploying aboard that ship to Vietnam in June of 72. Doug joined us for the 30-day transit
Whoa,
as a Siri instructor.
gosh, I never heard that one. And what? Then he flew home, or what? Do you know?
I don't know. He once
Yeah.
we arrived in the Philippines, he was gone after that. But we so appreciated his insights and
Cool.
gave us a lot of confidence.
Yeah, I heard from other people who went through senior school or read their memoirs, and they all speak extremely highly of him as an instructor.
That's amazing. That's
Yeah.
amazing that he could take his unusual experience and, without any kind of background in instruction or anything like that, and make a career out of it. And George, what did he say? You said that he gave you guys more confidence. What did he say that gave you confidence?
He gave a lot of insight as to how to behave, how to survive using humor or always tell the truth. But he explained that at a tactical level, we didn't know enough to harm the country and to resist to the fullest extent possible, but not to lose our life in the process.
Yeah.
And he gave one example, for example, of a POW who was threatened with execution by the North Vietnamese. And this POW said, "Oh, please kill me. If you kill me, my family will be wealthy beyond their wildest dreams." And they get, "What?" And he said, "Yes, I have something called Serviceman's Group Life Insurance. They will be wealthy. Please kill me." And they left him alone, put him back in his cell. And it was those kinds of anecdotes that gave us a bit of, oh gosh, it made it easier for us.
George, what was your job again? What did you do?
I was a lieutenant junior grade at the time. I was a reconnaissance attack navigator flying in the back of the RE-5C Vigilante, photo reconnaissance.
So you flew photo reconnaissance in 1972?
I did.
Were you flying for the Linebacker 2, the Christmas bombings?
Happily, during the Christmas bombings, the ship went to Hong Kong. We were on Liberty. But I did see one night flying over the Gulf of Tonkin, 6 SA-2 missiles launch, arc upward in the night, and wink out, missing all of their B-52 targets.
So this is something that you, as an aircrew member, kind of went over in your head. What would I do? How would I respond? It was in the back of your mind always.
Yeah, it was. We even learned the tap code ahead of time.
You did not.
It did. It's crazy.
Oh, this is so fascinating. George, thank you so much for joining us. Anybody else have any insights or questions or comments they want to share? I want to say hi to Brian. How are you doing, Brian? I haven't seen you since Vietnam, since our trip to Vietnam. He's not even looking at the camera. Um, Anybody else?
George, you mentioned that you went through and learned the tap code. Is that something you remember to this day? And how many people also learned the tap code on the way over? Let me ask you to unmute.
He's tapping.
Yeah, I'm tapping. I don't remember it now, but it was something that several of us of the flyers did, just in case.
You know, I think when I think of this story, I think of Bill Moran. Your father was on the Canberra during World War II, correct, Bill?
Yeah, he was on that ship
He
in
was,
Formosa when they were torpedoed, and then they had to be towed back, and they were used as a ship decoy for a while. And we never knew a whole lot about it, like most children of the World War II veterans, because they never talked about it. And just a tidbit of the Canberra. On my in-laws side of the family, I had been a relative of somebody for 35 years. We'd see each other at family events and everything. And there was never a conversation about our dads being in the service. Well, then one time he started to tell a story about his father who was starting to suffer from dementia. And he started talking about this ship he was on in World War II. And I'm like flabbergasted. I said, what ship was that? He says, the Canberra. Well, here our dads were on the same ship in Canberra when it was torpedoed. And for all we know, when they'd get together on Friday, on whatever night of the week when they used to have men's club at the local church hall, whether they talked about it, we don't know, but they were on the same ship. And Todd, he did some research for me way back when, and he found a little clipping of the soldiers from the sailors from the South Hills of Pittsburgh that were on the same ship that was torpedoed. There was like 12 guys in there. They're both their names. Jim Moran, Jim Breisinger. So I knew this guy for all this time. We never knew it. So then I'm telling this story another time to somebody after I hear it. And of course, it was a Marine that I'm telling this story to because I had to repeat it because he didn't. He said, what was the name of that ship? I said, it was USS Canberra. He says, I was on that ship in 1960. Now, I've known that guy for 35 or 40 years. The conversation never came up. So it's amazing the unwritten history that's out there, which makes this so great to be on conversations like this.
That's exactly it, Bill. These vets, I don't get you guys. You don't talk about this amazing experience that you guys have. I see William and Carol Wagner. You had your hand up. How you
Yes.
doing, Carol?
Hey, I'm doing good, but I had a question. If you could fill us in on when did the POW bracelets begin, that campaign where citizens bought a bracelet and we were supposed to pray for the member's name on the bracelet. And I heard that the POWs found out about that, and it made them feel really like they weren't forgotten.
I still have mine.
Of another
Of
man
another's
from
Lieutenant,
Wisconsin.
Lieutenant
Yeah,
Williams something.
he made it home.
They did make it home,
Mhm.
but then they asked us to turn our bracelets in. I said, heck no, I've been praying for this guy for years. I'm going to keep the bracelet. I still have his.
Yeah, we have it.
It was I think it was Veterans Day of 1970 that it started. And yeah. And do you know the Air Museum in Palm Springs, California? They have an exhibit there of turned in POW bracelets that they've matched with photographs of the POWs.
Oh, that's
It's
so neat.
really very, very moving. Yeah.
So were the bracelets part of this Go Public campaign?
You know, not officially, but because the issue was so, because the Nixon administration made such a big deal out of the issue, it gave two college students in California this idea, and they ran with it, and they got a lot of support, and they had a big press conference in LA with famous people there, and it took off. Millions of them were sold.
Yeah.
And yeah. So it was part of the Go Public, but it really wasn't a government thing. It was private people that just sort of fit in with it.
A
That's
private
also
civic
when
initiative.
yeah. Well, that was when the POWMIA flag also was born in that era too.
Right. Brad Washabaugh.
Oh, yes. Mark, thank you for the great show tonight. Did Doug ever go back to Vietnam? Did he ever want to? Do you have any information on that? And also, did you have a chance to get any of the North Vietnamese side, any interviews with the guards or recollections of interaction with Doug or any of the other POWs?
Yeah, two good questions. Thank you. Doug did not go back, although we didn't talk about Ross Perot. Because Ross Perot stuck his beak into the POW thing big time in 1969. He spent millions of dollars publicizing the plight of the POWs. He sent a cargo plane of 280 tons of food and toiletries that he wanted to send to North Vietnam for the POWs. He went with them, never got out of Laos. They wouldn't let him in. And Christmas of 69, he sent a plane load of wives and children to Paris to go intervene with the North Vietnamese embassy, the North Vietnamese delegation to the Paris peace talks. They didn't get anything out of that. And he asked Doug to go to Paris to talk to the North Vietnamese and ask them to send him, Doug, to Hanoi to publicize the plight of the POWs. So, of course, they didn't let it happen. So that was the only chance that would have happened, and nothing happened after that. And no, I couldn't even think of a way to try to get to talk to anybody in Vietnam. And there was enough material for me about the interrogators and the guards from all the POW memoirs that I think, paint a good enough picture of. I would have loved to in a perfect world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't even know how
good
you
question,
do
though.
to make those connections. Wonderful question. Bob Flage, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Speaking of the bracelets, I'm wearing mine since it's only come off for 6 operations, but the director of that museum has his wife first emailed me back in like 2018 asking for it. And I've talked to him a couple times. I just got another email from him. He still wants my original. It came from a kid that was in a recon with me that didn't make it. His chopper went down when they picked the recon team up, and they all went down the river except for, I think, the co-pilot. He was the only one that survived the thing, and they found one body. But like I said, this director of the program still wants my original. I told him my wife will send it to him, and I don't need it anymore.
Wonderful, Bob. Thank you.
It's a catharsis for me. I mean,
I'm sure it is.
I look at it anytime there's a bad thing going on. I can see, worse things. So.
I got to tell you, Bob, that has been the great blessing of my life working with the Veterans Breakfast Club is whenever I get frustrated or I think that something bad is happening to me, I think about some of the stories that I have heard and understand. I have it pretty easy. Chris
Well, the interesting thing is I also got a tattoo, a dragon, and I was in a Chinese restaurant in Tampa when I was doing some monitoring for the state. Oh God, in the 80s. And the waiter looked at it and he says, it's the right color, it's the right set, it's pointed in the right direction. It's lucky. The whole thing's lucky. So that made my day. It's made my day ever since.
How drunk were you when you got that tattoo, Bob?
I'm sorry?
How drunk were you when you got that tattoo?
Well, it was in Daytona, 1981.
Oh, okay. Okay.
A buddy of mine, we were on our 22nd or 23rd bike week, and he finally talked me into it. This guy was covered with tattoos, but we joke saying the good thing we weren't too drunk. We could have woken up with a bullet hole in the forehead. So that's it.
Thanks, Bob.
Yes, sir.
Chris Parolo, Navy expert, Navy veteran. How are you?
I'm fine today. A very, very good program. Always an honor to be in this crowd here. The POW movement was a grassroots movement because of the frustration that the Johnson administration was not really helping the wives. It started with the wives and then all the families. So that was grassroots, the flag, the bracelets, everything they did to put pressure on the government, testimony in front of the Congress by Mrs. Stockdale, everybody. And finally, the Nixon administration realized we need to get behind this, of course. But that's why it's not really talked about very much, because it was not something that the government pushed or at that time. It was the grassroots movement got the government involved, not the government getting the grassroots. Well, it wouldn't be grassroots if it was from the government. But anyway, I still have my bracelet as well, and I wore it when I traveled to Vietnam in 2017. I wore it all over the place just in honor of those gentlemen. And we went out to the, my friend Jerry Ween and I, we took a taxi out to the site where that B-52 was shot down in Hanoi. And I defiantly stood in front of the monument there, fist up, bracelet visible there, just on purpose. It was just my dig, just stupid little thing there. But I just felt I had to go honor those guys by taking that bracelet and standing in front of the wreckage of that B-52, which is actually a monument to the anti-air forces of Vietnam. Little bit of trivia here. The USS Canberra was supposed to be the USS Pittsburgh, but after the Australian ship, the Canberra, was lost in the Battle of Savo, they decided to honor the Australians by naming it the USS Canberra, but that was supposed to be USS Pittsburgh. Just some trivia.
And is it the only U.S. Navy ship?
It's the only ship named after a U.S. ship named after a foreign capital ever.
So that's all. Oh, by the way, if you're standing on the deck of a cruiser or a battleship and you're just not braced, or you're leaning over, or you're just not ready, and those guns go off, you could possibly be knocked overboard if you're standing in the right place. So that's
or the wrong place. Yeah.
Or the wrong place. Exactly. So.
Right. Marc, thank you so much for joining us. This is a big conversation, it's a one individual conversation or individual story, but a big conversation because the context of the POWs in Vietnam and the POW MIA movement is so important to our history. I think, Chris Parolo, we should work on a program about that movement. It was a grassroots movement. There are people who were involved from the very beginning who are still around. I think it would be a fascinating thing to have that conversation about how POWs were viewed before the movement started. This is really an enlightening story. Thank you, Marc, for working on the book. Thank you for coming on our program. I should let people know that you have a fascinating program of your own, podcast, a video cast for VVA magazine. You have really great guests. Can you tell us, do you have a guest coming up soon?
I can't remember the name. Oh, wait, it's the guy who does the Veterans Breakfast Club. What's his name? Todd, somebody. We're going to
you and I will be you and I will be talking on Wednesday about I'll be on your show.
It takes us, we're a little behind, so it takes us about 3 or 4 weeks before we post it. But when we do post it, I'll let you know, and you can let everybody know.
Well,
and I'm going to ask you some really hard questions, man.
You bet. You bet. I'll take the fifth on most of them, but I appreciate it very much, Marc, for you spending your time with us, for working hard on this book. I will be talking to you Wednesday. Everyone else, I hope to see you Thursday night for our program on World War II in the Caribbean. Thank you for joining us tonight. Stay warm and take care.